I remember the first time I heard the name Bellwood. It wasn't from a map. It wasn't from a history book, or a documentary, or a dusty plaque on the side of a road. I heard it from a man who didn't want to be overheard. He sat across from me in a diner that never played music loud enough to cover a private conversation, and he said the name like it was a secret that could spoil if spoken too boldly. Bellwood. Then he watched my face, waiting for recognition. When he didn't see it, something in him softened and broke at the same time. "Of course," he said, almost to himself. "Of course you don't know it." Outside the diner windows, rain tapped a slow rhythm on the glass. The highway beyond the parking lot stretched into fog, and the streetlights wore halos like tired saints. The man's hands were old hands, the kind that had opened too many doors and carried too many boxes. He held his coffee with both palms, like warmth was something precious. "How can you not know?" he asked. "It was a whole city." I told him I'd never heard of it. He smiled in a way that wasn't friendly. "That's the point," he said. He called himself Elias, not his full name. He didn't offer it. I didn't ask. He told me he'd once worked in insurance, the kind of job where you learn to study details the way other people study faces. The kind of job where you notice the difference between a burned kitchen caused by a faulty wire and a burned kitchen caused by a person who wants money more than truth. "Paper leaves tracks," he said. "It always does, even when people try to hide it. And if paper doesn't, people do." He leaned closer. "But sometimes," he said, "it's not people doing the hiding." The diner's neon sign buzzed once, like it had heard him and disagreed. Elias didn't flinch. He took a slow breath and looked out the window at the wet blacktop. Cars passed now and then, their headlights cutting the rain into bright needles. "I was supposed to go there," he said. "The week it happened. I had a case open. Routine. Fire claim in an apartment building near the river. I had the address, the policy number, the photographs. I had a file folder with the city's name on it." He paused. "And then one morning, I woke up and the city didn't exist." I would have laughed if his voice had carried even a trace of humor. But it didn't. It carried something heavier. Something that had been carried for years without ever being set down. He told me this story the way people tell stories when they've been dismissed too many times. Carefully, methodically, as if each detail was a nail he needed to hammer into the world. He told me about Bellwood before it vanished. Not just where it was, what it felt like. He described streets that smelled like baked bread in the early mornings. A river that ran slow and wide, reflecting the sky like a sheet of polished tin. A train yard that rattled the windows of nearby houses every time a freight car bumped into place, a sound that became part of the city's heartbeat. It wasn't a famous city, Elias said. It wasn't even one people drove through unless they had a reason. It was the kind of place that held itself together quietly. Factories, schools, a courthouse, a hospital, a minor league baseball field with bleachers that had been painted too many times. A downtown with brick storefronts and windows full of mannequins and outfits nobody could afford, but everybody liked to look at. And neighborhoods. Rows of porches. Children's chalk drawings on the sidewalks in summer. Leaves piling in gutters in autumn. Snow turning the streetlights into glowing cones in winter. A city that wasn't special. Which, Elias said, was what made it dangerous. The first sign, he told me, was the fog. He said it began a month before Bellwood disappeared, and at first nobody cared. Fog happens. Fog is normal. People complain about it, wipe their windshields, and get on with their day. But this fog wasn't like that. It didn't roll in from the river, or drift down from hills, or creep in with weather fronts. It appeared on still nights when the sky was clear enough to show stars. It settled low, hugging the streets like water. And once it settled, it stayed. People said it felt wrong, Elias told me. Not scary, just wrong, like you were walking through somebody else's breath. He said that drivers reported seeing streetlights blur into pale orbs. That store owners stepped outside at closing time and found their familiar blocks washed out, softened at the edges like a smudged photograph. Some nights, the fog was thin. Some nights, it was thick enough to swallow a car at the end of the block. And under it, always, there was that sound. A hum, not loud, not obvious, but steady, as if something deep underground was alive and turning slowly. Elias said some people joked about it. Old saw pumps, maybe. A factory machine left running. A new power station. But others stopped joking when their radios began to crackle. Not with voices. With a tone. A clean, thin note that would rise and fall, faint as a mosquito in the air, then disappear as if it had never been there. Weird month, Elias said. That's what people called it. The weird month. And then he told me about October 12th. The last normal day. It began like any other day. Elias described it the way you describe a day you didn't know was important until years later, when you replay it in your mind and try to find the moment you should have paid attention. Morning traffic. Commuters. School buses. Coffee shops opening their doors. A dog barking at nothing in particular. A man bought groceries. A woman picked up a prescription. A teenager got grounded for coming home late. A teacher gave a quiz. Nothing strange. But by late afternoon, the fog started early. It pooled at the corners of streets even before the sun had fully set. At twilight, it was already thick in the low parts of town. Elias said people described it as waiting. Like it knew something. By 9 p.m., calls came into the police station. Drivers reporting they couldn't see. People saying the street signs looked wrong. A woman insisting that the corner store had moved half a block overnight. The dispatcher wrote it down, Elias said, because dispatchers write things down even when they don't believe them. But the patrol officers didn't find any moved stores. They found fog. They found the hum, if they rolled their windows down and listened carefully. Then, at 11:48 p.m., the power flickered. Once. Twice. The streetlights blinked out, came back, blinked again, and then steadied. Bellwood exhaled, and the night went on. People turned over in bed. Someone laughed at a late-night television show. A nurse checked a patient's chart. A factory guard made his rounds. At 2:17 a.m., the last streetlight on Riverside Avenue blinked one final time. Elias said the witnesses never agreed on what they saw, but they all agreed on what they felt. Pressure, a sudden heaviness in the air, like the atmosphere had decided to lean closer. A tightening, the way your ears feel before a storm, except the sky was clear and windless. And then, nothing dramatic. No blast. No tremor. No sirens. Just a quiet shift, as subtle as a page turning. Elias said he talked to a man who was awake in Bellwood that night. A radio hobbyist, sitting at his kitchen table with headphones on, chasing late-night signals the way some people chase stars. The hobbyist told Elias that at 2:17, the static changed. It didn't get louder. It got cleaner. The hum rose into a higher pitch, like a string being pulled tight. And then, for one long breath of time, the radio went dead. Not silence. Absence. As if sound itself had stepped away. Then the static returned, ordinary, indifferent, and the clock kept ticking. The next morning, Bellwood was gone. Not in the sense of ruins or ash or broken towers. Gone in the sense that there was nothing to point to and say, there it was. Elias told me about the state trooper who first stumbled into the impossibility. The trooper got a call from a woman who said she couldn't find his sister. Not her sister's house. Her sister's city. The trooper assumed confusion. People calling confused all the time. But he drove out anyway. He reached the county line where the sign should have been, "Welcome to Bellwood." And it wasn't there. Not bent. Not stolen. Not knocked down in a storm. Just missing, leaving only the metal posts like skeletal fingers. He drove on, expecting to see the familiar descent into the city. But the road didn't descend. It continued straight, as if it had never been built to lead anywhere. He stopped. He stepped out, and in front of him was open land. Grass. Weeds. A dip where the river cut through the valley. A distant tree line with autumn colors. No rooftops. No traffic lights. No water tower. No Bellwood. Elias said the trooper radioed it in as a landslide. That was the only word his brain could reach for. A landslide could bury things. A landslide could erase roads. But there was no mound of earth. No cracked pavement. No broken foundation lines. The land looked old. Undisturbed. Like it had been empty for years. The trooper drove around for an hour, Elias said, circling the valley, checking side roads, trying to find some sign that a whole city existed. He found nothing. And that's when the second strange part began. Because if a city disappears, people should scream. Families should call. News stations should swarm. Politicians should demand answers. Helicopters should fly overhead. But the calls didn't come. Not the way they should have. Instead, the region behaved like it had woken up with a faint headache and couldn't quite remember the dream. Nearby towns ran their morning routines. Diners served breakfast. Schools opened. Newspapers printed. No headlines screamed about a missing city. No emergency alerts blared. It wasn't that people ignored it. It was that, for most people, there was nothing to ignore. Bellwood wasn't missing. Bellwood simply wasn't. Elias said it was like watching a room full of people react to a fire alarm that only one person could hear. Most shrugged. Most blinked in confusion. Some got annoyed and asked why you were making a fuss. Only a few stopped cold. Only a few looked into the empty valley and felt something inside them twist with recognition. Because they remembered. The ones who remembered didn't remember vaguely. They remembered the way you remember your own name. They remembered street names, bus routes, the smell of a particular bakery near the courthouse. They remembered the library's creaky third floor and the hospital corridor where the vending machine always jammed. They remembered where they'd fallen off a bike as a child. They remembered the sound of the river in spring. They remembered Bellwood. And when they tried to tell other people, the world looked back at them like they were speaking a language nobody else had learned. Hazel Crane, Elias told me, was one of the strongest rememberers. Hazel had been born in Bellwood, lived there for 42 years, raised children there, buried a husband there. She drove to where her apartment building should have been, not believing rumors, expecting a prank, expecting a terrible mistake. She parked on the shoulder of an empty road and walked into a field. She walked with her hands out in front of her, as if she could push the air aside and touch brick. She said she could feel the building. Not see it. Feel it. Like a pressure in the space where walls used to be. She walked forward, counted steps, turned where she knew the stairwell should have been, and stopped where her door should have been. Then she sat down on the grass and cried. Because there was nothing to knock on. No hallway. No neighbors' doors. No smell of cooking drifting under frames. Only open air. And the hum, faint as a sleeping animal, beneath the ground. Hazel reported it to the county office. The clerk looked at her with pity and said there had never been a Bellwood. Hazel demanded to see records. Her birth certificate listed Bellwood as her birthplace. The clerk examined it, frowned, and stamped it with a single phrase. Invalid municipality. Hazel said she could almost feel reality trying to correct her, trying to push her memory into a shape that fit the world. She refused. Elias told me the first physical proof came from a showbox. A man named Martin Vale had moved away years before Bellwood vanished. He lived 2 states over by the time rumors reached him. When he heard someone mention Bellwood, he laughed because he assumed they meant another town with a similar name. Then the person said, the city that disappeared. Martin didn't laugh after that. He went into his closet, pulled down a showbox of old photographs, and found a picture of a family picnic. In the background was a fountain with a carved lion's head. On the back of the photograph, in faded handwriting, were the words, Bellwood, Summer 48. Martin showed it to a local historian. The historian squinted, then nodded. He recognized the fountain, not from Bellwood, from an unmarked ruin deep in the woods, miles from any city, a stone fountain standing alone as if dropped there by accident. Martin drove out to see it. Elias said Martin returned pale, because the fountain was real. It existed, but it existed in a place that made no sense. And around it were other fragments. A curbstone, half buried. A strip of cracked asphalt beneath moss. A storm drain opening into date. Pieces of a city scattered like teeth. Not enough to rebuild. Just enough to prove that something had been torn apart. Elias said searchers found stranger things in the months that followed. A concrete staircase rising from a field and ending in open air. A bus bench bolted to a slab of sidewalk in the middle of a forest. A street sign reading Riverside AV discovered half submerged in a river 2 counties away. Authorities dismissed it as hoaxes. People who remembered Bellwood didn't laugh, because the pieces felt familiar, like an old song played in the wrong key. Then, Elias told me, the fences went up. Weeks after the disappearance, unmarked vehicles appeared on back roads near the valley. Men in plain coats stood at the edges of fields, holding clipboards as if measuring nothing. A new kind of sign appeared, "No trespassing," and beneath it, an agency name nobody recognized. The land where Bellwood had been was labeled undeveloped federal property. And the question nobody could answer was simple. How can undeveloped property have a highway running through it? The highway existed. Its lanes existed. Its painted lines existed. Its gentle slope where Bellwood should have begun existed. Everything was real except the city itself. Elias said he tried to speak to officials. They smiled politely. They nodded. They said there was nothing there. And when he pressed, when he showed them the old file folder he'd kept, he said their eyes slid away from the name as if they couldn't hold it in focus. Like reading it hurt. Like their minds refused to cooperate. That's when Elias stopped believing in cover-ups. Because cover-ups leave footprints. This felt cleaner. This felt like the world itself had been edited. Elias described the forgetfulness like a weather system. It had a center, the valley, and it had distance. People living close to the valley tended to forget completely. They'd never heard of Bellwood. They'd never known anyone from Bellwood. If you showed them a photograph labeled Bellwood, they'd frown and say the handwriting must be wrong. People farther away reacted with hesitation. They might say the name sounded familiar. They might feel a small flicker of recognition, but it would fade if they didn't grab it quickly. And then there were the resistant ones. The ones who remembered clearly, even when reality tried to smooth their memory down. Elias said it wasn't about intelligence or education. Some were professors. Some were factory workers. Some were old. Some were young. It was as if the forgetting could not take hold in certain minds. And those minds became lonely places to live. They lost friends who looked at them strangely. They lost family members who insisted they were confused. They were told to seek help, to stop obsessing, to move on. But how do you move on from your entire hometown vanishing? How do you move on when the world tells you your childhood happened in a place that never existed? Elias said some of the resistant ones began to dream of Bellwood. Not nightmares, dreams that felt like home. They'd dream of walking streets covered in fog, hearing voices they recognized but couldn't see. They'd dream of the river shining under streetlights. They'd wake up with their hearts aching. And in their dreams, always, there was the hum, as if something was calling them. Years passed. Bellwood faded from conversation, because you can't talk about a thing nobody agrees exists. But Elias didn't stop. He kept the file folder. He collected artifacts. He tracked down people with invalid municipalities stamped on their documents. He listened to their stories. He compared their details. He treated memory like evidence, because for him, it was the only evidence that remained. Then he told me about June Ketter. June was a radio hobbyist 40 miles away from Bellwood, who recorded static on reel-to-reel tape for the comfort of it. On the night Bellwood vanished, she recorded as usual. When she played the tape back the next day, she heard something inside the static. A voice. Faint, distorted, but human. It was repeating a phrase in a broken loop. Please, where are we, please? Then more voices joined it. Crowded, overlapping, confused. And beneath them, the hum rising into that thin, tightening note. At 2:17 a.m. on the tape, the voices stopped. Not fading, stopping, as if someone had cut a wire. Then came silence. Not radio silence. Not a pause. A clean absence that felt too deliberate to be natural. And then the static resumed like nothing had happened. June took the tape to a station manager. He listened once, then told her never to bring it back. When she asked why, he said, because someone will come for it. June hid the tape. Elias tracked her down decades later and listened to it in her living room. He told me the hair on his arm stood up when the voices vanished. He told me he'd never heard silence like that before. Not silence as a lack of sound. Silence as a thing. Elias said he returned to the valley on an autumn night years later. He wasn't supposed to. The area was fenced and watched. But fences are designed for people who believe in rules. Elias believed in proof. He parked miles away and walked through trees until the fog found him. He said it didn't drift in. It waited. It gathered around him like it recognized him, like it had been expecting someone who remembered. The hum began low. then rose. Elias said it didn't feel like fear. It felt like pressure, like standing near a massive machine you can't see. He reached the clearing where the main avenue of Bellwood should have begun. He stepped into the open field. He lifted his hand, and he felt resistance. Not wind, not cold. Resistance, like his palm was inches from glass. He held it there and waited. Minutes passed. The fog thickened. Then, slowly, lights appeared in the fog. Not flashlights, not car headlights. Street lights. Warm amber dots in a straight line, spaced like a city block. Elias said his throat tightened, because for a moment he could see shapes behind the fog. A faint rooftop edge. The suggestion of a water tower. The silhouette of a building. Bellwood. Or something wearing Bellwood like a costume. Elias stepped forward. The hum spiked into a high tone that made his ears ring. He dropped to one knee, not in pain exactly, but overwhelmed, like his senses were being asked to process something they weren't built for. When he looked up again, the lights were gone. The field was empty, and the fog began to drift away as calmly as it had come. Elias stumbled back to his car. He never went back again. But he believed, from that night on, that Bellwood wasn't destroyed. It was relocated, pulled sideways through a seam in the world. A room next to ours with the door locked. He stared at his coffee like it held the answer. "What do you want me to do with this?" I asked him. Elias finally looked at me, and his eyes were tired. "Remember it," he said. I waited, thinking he would say more. That he would ask me to publish it, to investigate, to chase officials, to demand documents. But he didn't. He only said, "That's how it stays gone. People don't remember. People don't talk. People don't hold it in their minds." He tapped the table once, gently. "They didn't just take the city," he said. "They took the agreement that it existed." I told him I'd never heard anything like it. Elias gave me a small, sad smile. "You will," he said. Then he reached into his coat and slid something across the table. A photograph. A family picnic. A stone fountain with a lion's head in the background. On the back, faded handwriting. Bellwood, summer 48. He stood up, left money under his cup, and walked out into the rain. I watched him go, and for a moment, the diner's neon light flickered, and I thought I heard something under the sound of the storm. A faint, steady hum. I drove toward the valley a week later, not because I believed him completely, because I couldn't stop thinking about the way he'd said the name. Bellwood, as if it was a place he could still smell. The highway was ordinary for miles. Gas stations, diners, billboards advertising things nobody needs. Then the road dipped and the land opened. The valley was quiet. Too quiet. Not empty exactly. There were trees. There were birds. There was wind moving through dry grass. But there was a blankness to it, a sense that it should have held something larger than it did. I pulled over where the city's sign should have been. There were no posts now, no frame, no bolts. Just grass. I stood at the edge of the field and looked out. And the strangest part was not what I saw. It was what I didn't. My mind kept reaching for shapes. Streets. Buildings. A water tower. As if the idea of a city was hovering just beyond my perception, like a word on the tip of the tongue. I took a step forward. The air felt normal. I took another. And then I stopped. Because for a brief second, I thought I heard it. Not loud. Not clear. But there, beneath the wind. A hum. Steady. Patient. Waiting. And for one heartbeat, I had the sharp, impossible feeling that if fog rolled in right then, if the world softened at the edges, I might see streetlights, warm amber dots in a line, and I might finally understand what Elias meant when he said a city can be taken sideways. I backed away, not in fear, in respect, because some doors aren't meant to be forced, some absences aren't meant to be filled, and some places, once removed, don't want to be found.